Welcome to your second lecture on leasehold conveyancing, and in this lecture we're going to be looking at buying and selling an existing lease. So we're talking here about where the lease was granted some time ago, maybe a few years ago, maybe many years ago, and a buyer is now coming along and buying the remaining term of that lease from the existing tenant. So we're going to look at various aspects to do with the transaction. In terms of generally the transaction itself will be very similar to what I taught you within freehold. So for example, the searches that you do, the general sort of process that you go through. So what we're really going to do here is look at the extra things or the different things that need to be done because you're dealing with a leasehold transaction. And the first thing really, in respect of taking instructions, is to consider whether the landlord's consent is required for this assignment. Now, when we talk about leases and the transfer of leases, we sometimes refer to them as being assigned. So either the lease is being transferred or the lease is being assigned. There used to be sort of different terms, depending on whether you're talking registered land or unregistered land, but these days they're pretty interchangeable, to be honest. So in terms of the landlord's consent, whether you're acting on behalf of the seller or the buyer in this transaction, you obviously need to take full instructions from your client as to the details. And one of the first things that both parties need to establish is whether the landlord's consent is required to the assignment. Now, in terms of the landlord needing to consent to this, there will be a lease covenant in the lease stating that the landlord's prior written consent is required before an assignment, if that is the case. And to find that, to have a look, you need to look at the alienation covenant of the lease. So if that is the case, then it is for the seller's solicitor to apply to the landlord for their consent. And really that needs to be done as early as possible in the transaction so that no delay is caused, that that's not the only thing that you're waiting on to process and proceed with the transaction. Now, in terms of the landlord giving their consent, there's two possibilities. The lease covenant may expressly state that the landlord's prior written consent is required and their consent cannot be unreasonably withheld. That is what we call the test of reasonableness. Now, if that latter part is not there, so if there's no mention of the landlord being able to unreasonably withhold their consent, then statute assists, and it's section 19(1), lowercase a, of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, that automatically implies that test of reasonableness. So just to explain that, if the clause simply states that for an assignment the landlord's prior written consent is required, and there's no mention of reasonableness, that statute automatically adds it in so that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold their consent. Now, the other thing that needs to be considered is whether the buyer has to give references, because the landlord may require those. And Standard Condition 8.3 really deals with both of these points about consent and references. Standard Condition 8.3 applies if consent to assignment or subletting is required to enable completion to take place. And Standard Condition 8.3.2a state to apply for the consent at their own expense and to use all reasonable efforts to obtain it. So I've already mentioned that it is for the seller to approach the landlord and ask for their consent. Standard Condition 8.3.2b requires the buyer then to provide all information and references reasonably required to obtain that consent. So there is also an onus on the buyer to actually provide information, get references if that's what the landlord wants. So again, you really need to establish at a pretty early stage in the transaction if references are needed because the landlord's requested them so that they can actually get on and obtain those and again not cause any delay. Now, this standard condition actually allows for rescission of the contract if the landlord's consent is not forthcoming 3 working days before completion, or if it has been given but has a condition attached to it to which either party reasonably objects. So if it comes in and there's something that either the seller or the buyer object to, then the contract can be rescinded. Now, in terms of effecting rescission, you just need to give written notice to the other side, and that will be enough. And in that instance, neither party is in breach of contract, so there can be no claims for damages, for example. Now, the landlord will require their costs to be paid in connection with giving this consent by way of the assignment. And the way that they do this is that there is a formal licence to assign that is actually prepared, and the landlord's solicitor will prepare that document. Now, whilst they will have their own solicitor to do this, the landlord is not going to want to pay the costs of their solicitor doing that. So the seller will be responsible for paying those costs, as well as obviously paying their own solicitors. Now, the landlord's solicitor will want an undertaking that their costs will be paid whether or not this matter proceeds to completion. So even if the transaction never fully goes ahead and doesn't complete, if they have undertaken work, they're going to want the costs being paid for that work having been carried out. Now, before giving the undertaking, because it will be the seller solicitor that is going to give the undertaking to pay the costs, the seller solicitor should put a maximum sum on the amount of costs so that they are capped. And they should also really find out the hourly rate of the landlord solicitor, just in case there's extra work that's going to be involved, so that they have an idea of what the hourly costs could be. Really importantly, before you ever give an undertaking to pay somebody else's costs, you should always get the cleared funds for those costs from your client. So before the seller solicitor gives that undertaking to the landlord solicitors, you must, as a seller solicitor, get cleared funds from the seller to cover those costs. Never make a promise to pay somebody else's costs if you don't have the money to do so. In terms of protocol, there's a little sort of extra requirement. Now, the seller's going to need to give the buyer details of rent, service charge, and insurance payments that have been made. And in protocol cases, the seller solicitor is required to produce service or maintenance charge accounts for the last 3 years, where that's appropriate, so where that has been paid, and also evidence of payment as well. Now, in terms of documents that the seller solicitor will send, many of these will be the same sort of process, if you like, that you've been taught when you've dealt with freehold transactions, but because it's leasehold, there's going to be extra things that you need to send as well. So, of course, the draft contract in duplicate needs to be prepared by the seller solicitor, and that will get sent to the buyer solicitor as part of the pre-contract package. I'll talk to you shortly about an extra little clause that needs to go in that draft contract where there's a management company involved. A copy of the lease, the original, will get sent on completion, but in the meantime, the buyer solicitor is going to want to read through that lease and investigate title to that. And when you're talking about registered land, official copy entries also need to be sent over. Now, I spoke to you in the last lecture about title to be shown, so I'm just going to cover briefly again a few points on that to do with registered and unregistered land. So in terms of registered title, the seller solicitor obviously needs to provide copies of that registered leasehold title because it needs to be investigated, and also the freehold as well where that's registered, because it's always a good idea when you're buying a lease to investigate the freehold title as well. Now, that's fairly straightforward because if both of those are registered at the land registry, it's very easy to get those official copies, and if freehold official copies are not provided by the seller solicitor, then obviously the buyer can easily obtain those copies direct from the land registry. The other thing, if it's registered, of course, the lease is already registered, is again at the land registry, it's a more straightforward process because you are simply transferring the registered title over to your client. You don't have to produce the freehold title in order to get title absolute because that lease has already been registered. Now, that's different to unregistered land. So if you're buying an unregistered lease, then at that point you're going to trigger registration at the land registry and you are going to need to get or want to get absolute title. So you'd have to produce the freehold title at that point to the land registry in order to get that. Now, in terms of triggering that registration, depending, I would think you're going to do that because it's highly unlikely you're going to be buying a lease for less than 7 years on the term when we're talking about long leaseholds. So if this lease had been originally granted many, many years ago, prior to compulsory registration, nothing's happened to it since, but your client is now buying it, that would trigger first registration of that lease if it's still got more than 7 years to run on it. Now, under the open contract rules, there's no no right for the buyer to see the freehold title. Section 44 of the Law of Property Act 1925 says that the buyer can insist on seeing the lease of the property that they're buying, supported by all deeds of assignment and other legal documents dealing with that legal estate, representing a period of ownership for what will be no great surprise to you, the last 15 years. So we've got that kind of 15-year period that we go back. But you're not entitled to details of any superior titles like the freehold. The standing conditions are silent on this point, so if you need the freehold, because A, you need to investigate it, but B, you need it because you're going to trigger registration at the land registry, then you should always put a special condition in the contract requiring the seller to deduce title to the freehold. Now, as a buyer, you should always insist on seeing the freehold title prior to exchange, because that's when you're going to investigate, but you should always cover the point with the special condition in the contract, and then ultimately you'll have the freehold title as well, and you can deal with registration afterwards when you need to. In terms of other documents the seller solicitor is going to send, the property information form, so that's exactly the same forms as we spoke about with freehold, but in addition, you've now got the leasehold property information form as well to be completed and sent. Receipts for rent and service charges, where payable. The last 3 years service charge accounts, again, where you've got that service charge being paid. Insurance details, very important to send over a copy of both the insurance policy and the receipts for the last premium that was paid. And where you've got a management company involved, you should send the memorandum and articles of association of the management company, again, just to show that they are solvent and to show that they have power to deal with the property. Now, in terms of the rest of the transaction, it's fairly similar to the freehold in terms of the fact that the buyer will then investigate title, they will carry out the searches they need, they will raise requisitions, etc. So in terms of preparing for completion, you've got to consider what form of purchase deed you're going to use. Now, the process of transferring the lease to the buyer will be by way of transfer, where you're talking about registered land, or where the lease has not yet been registered, so unregistered title. Technically speaking, we've in the past used an assignment. However, if the assignment of that lease is going to induce first registration, which is, as I said to you a second ago, is very likely, because you're not going to buy a long leasehold like this with less than 7 years on the term, then the transfer should be used. So hence these are kind of interchangeable terms that we use when we talk about leases. You know, sometimes we might say we're transferring a lease, sometimes we might say we're assigning a lease, but ultimately most of the time in the transaction itself we use a transfer. Now, in terms of pre-completion searches, prior to completion, in the case of registered land, you need to do your OS1 search, but obviously you'll be doing this against the leasehold title, so exactly the same way as we said about when you're buying freehold, but you're doing an OS1 against the leasehold here. I think it's very unlikely you'll never do an OS2 search, because I don't think you're really ever going to purchase part only of a leasehold title, so most likely it's going to be the OS1. And of course, prior to completion, you must do your bankruptcy search against your own client borrower on Form K16. Must do that when you've got a mortgage involved, but good practice to do anyway. And again, you would have done those searches just prior to exchange as well, to check nothing's changed on the title and check your client isn't bankrupt. In unregistered land, prior to exchange, you would have done full land charges searches on Form K15 against all the leasehold owners, past and present, and also the freehold owners, past and present, and your bankruptcy search too. And then prior to completion, you only need to repeat that land charges search against the current leasehold owners. Again, just to check that nothing has changed, nothing new has been added and registered against their names. And again, you would repeat your bankruptcy search too on Form K16. Now, if you've got a company involved in the transaction, don't forget you also need to do the company search as well. Now, in terms of the landlord's licence, the executed licence to assign will be required prior to completion, and all parties will execute that document. It doesn't get dated until completion to actually bring it into effect. And just again, keep in mind the circumstances that I mentioned to you a minute ago, where the licence hasn't been received 3 working days before completion, or if there's a condition in it to which either party objects, then the contract could be rescinded. Now, it's just important to consider about shares in a management company if there is a management company involved. On completion, the buyer will take over the seller's share in the management company, because where you've got a management company, it is the tenants that own the shares in that. So when you buy the lease and there's a management company, the buyer takes over the seller's share in that company. Now, the chances are this will have been sold to the buyer for no consideration, so it will just kind of form part and parcel of the purchase price. But whether there is consideration involved or not, you should have a special condition in the contract stating that the seller will transfer their share in the management company to the buyer on completion, and then either for no consideration or for however much it is, if there is going to be consideration involved. Now, you then need to consider whether you need to complete a stock transfer form at all. If the share is being sold for £1,000 or less, or there is a particular reason for it to be exempt from stamp duty land tax, then what needs to happen is the seller needs to complete the certificate on the back of the stock transfer form, so a stock transfer form, in order to transfer their share. If the buyer is not paying anything at all, then there's actually no need to complete that stock transfer form. If one is completed, then it needs to be sent to Revenue and Customs. Now, in terms of what will then happen after completion, is that the original share certificate will be sent back to the management company, so the seller's share certificate, together with the stock transfer form, if that's been required, or evidence that the tax has been paid, or the evidence that it's exempt, and the management company will then issue a new share certificate in the name of the buyer. So that stock transfer form is really dependent upon the transaction, and you can just have a look at the up-to-date advice on Revenue and Customs website as to whether one needs to be completed, whether it needs to be sent to Revenue and Customs, and also how Revenue and Customs are dealing with the acknowledgement of having received that form. In terms of completion statement, a completion statement will need to be prepared exactly as you would do in the same way with a freehold transaction. The only difference here is that you're going to have some apportionments on that completion statement in respect of rent, service charge, and insurance payments. And the insurance payments may well be under the service charge, so part and parcel of the service charge payment, it may not be separate. And these apportionments will be the buyer contributing the rent, service charge, insurance payments back to the seller. So in other words, repaying them some of this money. Now, the reason that we have to do this is because rent and service charge and insurance payments are payable in advance. So when the seller obviously is sitting in the property and they have the lease, they will have paid all of this in advance, possibly quarterly is most likely, possibly maybe a bit longer than that. If they're therefore selling the property partway through that quarter, they are basically owed a refund on some of the rent, service charge, and insurance they've paid in advance. Otherwise, the buyer is effectively getting that money for nothing, if you like, they're getting those free things. So that's why we have to do this. Now, where, in terms of the completion statement, I'll come back to more on that in a second about those apportionments and how they work, but where you're acting for a buyer and you're doing your completion statement, you will also need to remember to add on the fees for notices that need to be sent to the landlord on completion. It is highly likely under the lease that the landlord will require notice of the assignment once it's actually completed, and also if there's a mortgage involved in the transaction, they will require notice of that mortgage, and there will be a separate fee for each of those. In terms of the seller's completion statement, they will need to have added onto theirs the costs to the landlord solicitor in preparing that licence to assign. So they're kind of the extra things, if you like, on top of what you would normally expect to see on a completion statement. Now, in terms of the apportionments, so I'll come back to that. Standard condition 6.3.5 is the relevant standard condition when it comes to apportionments. Because what this standard condition says is that where a sum to be apportioned is not known or easily ascertainable at completion, a provisional apportionment should be made according to the best estimate available. As soon as the final amount is known, a final apportionment then has to be made and notified to the party, and any resulting balance has to be paid no more than 10 working days later, and if not paid, then the balance is to bear interest at the contract rate from then until completion. Now, the reason that we may not know exactly how much is owing is because service charge is done on estimates. So the current tenant, the seller, will be paying an approximate service charge throughout the year, so what they think needs to be paid, and then at the end of the financial year, the actual calculation is done, if you like, so the actual accounts are done to see how much expenditure has been incurred in respect of that building, and then if at that point the tenants owe any more money, then they pay up the extra bit of service charge that is owed. If there's been a surplus, so if the tenants have paid too much service charge throughout the year, you'd like to think that they would get a refund. That doesn't normally happen. Instead, the extra money gets put into a reserve fund or a sinking fund towards bigger items of expenditure. So the point here is that when you're doing these apportionments, you are apportioning on the best estimate. So what the seller has paid to date is what you go on. But actually, you may get to the end of the financial year, and once the accounts are done, you realise that the seller actually should have been paying a lot more while they were the tenant. And that's where standard condition 6.3.5 comes in and says at that point we do the final apportionment. So just to give you an example of how this apportionment works. So if completion is on the 1st of March, then the seller has been making quarterly payments on the rent and the service charge, and so the quarterly day is the 25th of March. So effectively, they are going to want a 25-day refund from the buyer because they have paid that money up for the next 25 days, and then the buyer is taking over the lease on the 1st of March. So they just make that apportionment on those dates. Now, because we have this idea of this best estimate being done and a final apportionment being done potentially many, many months later at the end of the financial year, it's quite common for the parties to agree that a certain sum will be retained on completion. So what that means is that the seller's solicitors will retain a sum of money from their client on completion, and they will hang on to that money until the final apportionment is made so that it can then be done. And the reason that we do this is because it's not very easy to get money from clients several weeks or months later in respect of a transaction. If this deal is done, they've sold the flat, 9 months ago, and then you contact them saying, oh, actually, I need £50 from you because the apportionment, was slightly out, the chances of you getting that money are going to be very difficult, really. So we agree this retention, and we put a clause in the contract stating that the sum of money will be held back, and in that instance, it will be apportioned under the standard conditions, and then any resulting balance will be paid to the parties. Now, in terms of completion itself, the buyer solicitor should insist on seeing the last receipt for ground rent and service charge to make sure they're clear. What I mean by that is that there's no breaches of covenant, okay, and that all rental payments based on today. So there's no query that there could be a forfeiture for any breach because of non-payment. Buyer solicitor will also need to receive the licence to assign, all the title deeds, and that should include the original lease, any share certificate if that's relevant, any stock transfer form if that's relevant, and of course the transfer deed, together with any other deeds and documents that may be relevant. Post-completion, you've got stamp duty land tax, so exactly the same way that I said to you about the grant of a new lease. On completion, stamp duty land tax needs to be calculated, and it's paid on the basis of the rent and the premium. You can do the calculation online again, and you complete your SDLT forms, you get your SDLT 5 certificate back from Revenue and Customs, and of course that will need to be sent to the land registry. In terms of notices, I mentioned these to you a minute ago. So if it's required by the lease, then notice of the assignment and also notice of any mortgage, if there is one, together with the fees, will need to be sent to the landlord solicitor in duplicate. We send them a duplicate because we ask them to receipt one of them and return it to us, and then they keep the other copy. And exactly the same way with the mortgage. You would send 2 copies and ask for the same thing. Now, post-completion, you're going to have a final service charge adjustment at some point. So this will hopefully be as soon as possible after completion. But as I say, it's not going to be until the financial year end. So it could be some time. And it's worth making a file note of when that year end is going to be, because it may be months since you've dealt with the transaction. And then, of course, that adjustment needs to be made, and the payment must be made within the 10 days of that adjustment. So it's worth making a note of when that needs to happen. And then you've got registration into your client's name, into the buyer's name. That must happen within the priority period of your OS1 search where you're dealing with registered land. And in the case of unregistered land, that lease must be registered within 2 months of completion. So the usual rules about when registration must take place. And then you've got to think about who's going to hold the title deeds. So we've got a lender involved, so client or lender. Many lenders these days, because obviously everything's registered, they don't want any deeds, so the client can keep that or you can keep that on their behalf. All I would say is the original lease is still important, so just make sure the client keeps that in a safe place if you hand it over to them. And I just want to mention to you briefly about common hold. Common hold is a model that was taken from abroad, so like United States, Australia, and it made substantial changes to leasehold property law. So it's a special form of freehold ownership, so it's a different way of owning land, and it was introduced by the Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002, so quite some time ago. And it was intended by the Act that there should be another way an owner can hold a freehold estate. And we know from me speaking to you in the last lecture, you can't have freehold as such of flats because they become flying freeholds and it just doesn't work. But this is another way of trying to get people to actually have an element of freehold. Now, it's called common hold, even though really it's a little bit like dealing with freehold. And the other reason it was created was to help tackle some of the deficiencies that we have in leasehold land, because leasehold ownership is not perfect because of all the covenants and things that are involved. So it's another way of trying to find a different way of making it work, really. Now, in terms of common hold itself, each separate property in a common hold development is called a unit, and that unit can actually be residential or commercial. So to me, unit sounds a little bit commercial, makes me think of sort of units on an industrial estate, but actually it can refer to residential properties too. And each owner of a unit is known as a unit holder. Now, there will be a common hold association that owns and manages the common parts of the common hold development, so the common areas, if you like, and that company will be limited by guarantee. And the way that it works is that all members of the company, so in terms of that sort of common hold association, all members will be unit holders and own a share in that common hold association. So what that means is that unit holders basically have like duality of ownership because they own their own unit, but they also have a share of the common hold association, and so indirectly they own the common parts too. Now, all common hold is registrable at the land registry and requires registration of the common hold community statement, and that statement contains the rules and regulations of the common hold. So you can see how it's a bit of a mixture really of kind of freehold with elements of how we kind of control leasehold as well. Now, at the moment, it is possible for owners of existing non-common hold property to actually try and convert their title to a common hold, but 100% of the owners have to agree to that conversion, and the freeholder must also consent to that conversion. And you can find a little bit more about common holds within your textbook. Now, they haven't been very popular to date. I personally have never come across one, and that might be because looking at the recent statistics, there's actually less than 20 common hold developments in the whole of England and Wales as of July 2020. So when you think about the whole country, that's very few that have actually become common hold developments. What I would say to you is do keep an eye though on future changes, because the Law Commission in July 2020 published a common hold report recommending changes such as leaseholders being in control of the conversion process and not every person having to agree to convert to a common hold. It very much recommended a more flexible approach to common holds and really wants to make it the preferred alternative to leasehold. So all I would say to you is that Law Commission report is fairly recent, but just be aware of this, keep an eye on this, because there could well be some developments on common hold coming up in the near future. And that concludes your second lecture on leasehold.